We're going to start competition. First team on the board, Florian and Marcel. For execution, 6, 5.5, 5.5, 6.5. For synchro, 6.5, 5, 4.5, 5, 4.5. Dan and Matthew. For execution, 6.5, 7, 7, 7. For synchro, 8, 6.5, 8.5, 7.5, 8.5. Noah William and Johan. For execution, 7, 7, 6, 6. For synchro, 7.5, 6.5, 6.5, 6.5, 6.5. Baris en Berthoek. For execution, 6.5, 7.5, 7, 7. For synchro, 7.5, 7.5, 7.5, 7, 7. Lewis and Arthur. For execution, 7.5, 8, 7.5, 7. For synchro, 7, 7, 7.5, 6.5, 6.5. Round 2, Florian and Marcel. For execution, 5.5, 5, 5, 6.5. For synchro, 5, 6, 6, 5.5, 6.5. Dan and Matthew. For execution, 6.5, 6.5, 7, 7. For synchro, 8, 7.5, 9, 8, 9. Noah, William en Johan. For execution, 7, 7, 6.5, 7.5. For synchro, 7.5, 7.5, 7.5, 7, 8. Baris en Berthoek. For execution, 6.5, 7, 6, 4.5. For synchro, 7, 6.5, 5, 6, 7. Lewis and Arthur. Synchro 4, your mark? Yeah, just what's your mark? 8? For execution, 7.5, 7, 7.5, 8. For synchro, 7, 8.5, 9, 8, 8. Round 3. Florian en Marcel. For execution, 6.5, 5.5, 6, 6.5. For synchro, 7.5, 7, 7, 6.5, 6.5. Dan en Matthew. For execution, 7, 6.5, 6.5, 7.5. For synchro, 8, 8, 7.5, 7, 7.5. Noah, William en Johan. For execution, 6, 7, 5.5, 6. For synchro, 7, 6.5, 6.5, 7.5, 6.5. Baris en Berthoek. For execution, 6.5, 6.5, 7, 7.5. For synchro, 7, 8.5, 8.5, 7.5, 8. Lewis and Arthur. For execution, 7.5, 7.5, 6, 7. For synchro, 7, 8, 7.5, 6.5, 6. Round 4. Florian en Marcel. For execution, 5.5, 6, 4.5, 5. For synchro, 6.5, 5, 6, 5, 5.5. Dan en Matthew. For execution, 6.5, 6.5, 6, 7. For synchro, 8, 8, 8, 8, 7.5. Noah, William en Johan. For execution, 6.5, 6.5, 6, 7. For synchro, 8, 8, 7, 7.5, 7.5. Baris en Berthoek. For execution, 7, 6.5, 7, 6.5. For synchro, 7.5, 7.5, 7.5, 8, 8. Lewis and Arthur. For execution, 6.5, 7, 4, 4.5. For synchro, 6, 5.5, 6, 5, 4.5. Round 5. Florian and Marcel. For execution, 6, 6, 6, 5.5. For synchro, 6, 6, 6, 6.5, 7.5. Dan and Matthew. For execution, 1.5, 1, 7, 6.5. For synchro, 2, 3.5, 2.5, 3.5, 3. Noah, William and Johan. For execution, 6.5, 6, 5.5, 7. For synchro, 7, 6.5, 6.5, 6.5, 7. Baris en Bertou. For execution, 7, 7, 6, 6. For synchro, 7.5, 7.5, 7.5, 8, 8.5. Lewis and Arthur. execution, 7, 6, 5.5, 6.5. For synchro, 7, 7.5, 7.5, 7, 6.5. This was the last dive of this competition. Thank you, judges. Thank you, secretaries. We're going to have our medal ceremony as soon as possible.